Welcome to the American Eel Management Board. I'd like to call this meeting to order. My name is Phil Edwards. I'm the administrative proxy for Rhode Island. With me today up front are Caitlin Stocks and Dr. Kristen Anstead with the Commission, and Dr. Sheila Ira, the Stock Assessment Chair. Later in the meeting, Dr. Jerry Flowers will join us. So he's the chair of the peer review panel. I'd like to start with the approval of the agenda. Are there any proposed modifications to the agenda? Please raise your hand. Is there anything online? Seeing none, the agenda is approved by consent. Moving on to the approval of the proceedings for October 2021. The proceedings were in your materials. Are there any corrections or edits? Anything online? Seeing none, I approve the October 2021 proceedings by consent. Next item on the agenda is public comment for those items not on the agenda. At this time, we have one person signed in, Mike Lilly from the Interstate Commission on the Potomac River Basin. Go ahead, Mike.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, members of the American Eel Management Board. I'm Mike Nardolilli. I'm the Executive Director of the Interstate Commission on the Potomac River Basin. In 1940, Congress approved a compact between the 5 jurisdictions in the Potomac River Basin: Virginia, West Virginia, Maryland, DC, and Pennsylvania. I'm here today to just introduce myself and hope that we can work together in the future. You probably know of ICPRB best from our efforts to restore the shad to the Potomac River. Jim Cummings, our aquatic biologist, a few years ago. Some of my aquatic biologists have expressed an interest in helping restore the American eel to the upper reaches of the Potomac River by working on eel ladders around dams 4 and 5, which were leftovers from the old C&O Canal days. So I'm here just to indicate that I'm really hoping that we can work together, and I look forward to hearing about the American eel proceedings today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike, for the introduction. Do we have anybody else online for public comment? Okay, that was the end of the public comment. We will now go to item number 4, review and consider the 2022 benchmark stock assessment and peer review report for management use and response if necessary. Okay,
go ahead.
You can go ahead.
Good morning, Chairman, the American Eel Board. My name is Jeff Pierce. I'm with the Maine Elver Fishermen's Association from Maine. The Maine Elver Fishermen and a number of NGOs have been working with the state of Maine. The state of Maine have been working since 2012 to open up more habitat and improve fish passage, both upstream and downstream migration, which is most important to get the silver eels out. These river systems have been flourishing since we've been doing this work. And the decisions you make today affect our communities and our fishermen. We hope you all take that into consideration, as these are sentinel fisheries. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff, for the public comment. Is there any other public comment? Okay, we'll move to item 4, review and consider the 2022 benchmark stock assessment and peer review report for management use and response if necessary. We're going to have a series of 3 presentations and a discussion and questions following. I'd like to introduce Dr. Sheila Ira for the presentation on the stock assessment report.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We can go to the next slide. So today I'll be presenting on the stock assessment for the American eel that was completed in late 2022. This is an outline of the material that will be covered in today's presentation. Next slide. There's a number of challenges that complicate the assessment of the American eel stock that has the geographic distribution within the Atlantic States Marine Fishery Commission. It occupies a wide variety of habitats from the ocean to estuaries and freshwater. It's a pan-mictic species ranging from Brazil to Canada, which means they are a single stock. The stock is managed by several authorities depending on its location within its geographic range, and the life history characteristics vary by sex, location, and area within the geographic range. Other potential impacts to the population are difficult to quantify, including habitat loss from dams, climate change, and the non-native swim bladder parasites. These challenges lead to the inability to model and produce traditional reference points for the species. Next slide. Previous assessment efforts through the Atlantic States were completed in 2005, 12, and 17. The 2005 assessment was not accepted for management use due to shortcomings in the assessment. The 2012 benchmark assessment evaluated different modeling approaches and trend analyses, but reference points from the models were not accepted for management use. In 2017, there was an update to the benchmark with an extended time series and supported the depleted status that was found in the 2012 benchmark. Next slide. The current assessment has many of the same issues with the previous assessments that were not resolved. Attempted models and approaches from the previous peer review, including the delayed difference model to develop reference points. Further exploration was also done on surplus production models and the traffic light approach. Other methods were considered in this assessment, including a GIS-based habitat analysis, updating the indices and trend analyses, and evaluating the use of data poor methods for assessment that had been developed and simulation tested by the Northeast Fisheries Science Center to provide management advice. Next slide. It's important to note that the SAS had issues with assessing the status of American eel stock, and that is not unique to the American eel or to the United States. New Zealand has abandoned analytical stock assessment methods and is currently proceeding with a habitat-oriented assessment approach. The European eel has been assessed by an ICES working group and have identified similar challenges to assessing their stock as what has occurred on the Atlantic coast of the US. The Canadian Department of Fisheries and Oceans has assessed the American eel in Canada, and they were not able to develop reference points for their portion of the stock in their waters. Now to move into the assessment, I'm going to cover the life history and stock definition. The American eel ranges from Canada and Greenland south to Brazil on the Atlantic coast. It's a single pan-mictic stock with adults from all areas of the range traveling to the Sargasso Sea to spawn. In this assessment, the only portion of the population that was assessed was from the US Atlantic coast, indicated by the red circle. As a reminder of the eel life history, the life cycle, adults from the entire range congregate in the Sargasso Sea to spawn. The eggs hatch and the larval eels travel ocean currents to reach the coast where they transform into glass eels and then migrate inland. Eels mature through the elver and yellow phases before becoming silver and then beginning their migration back to the Sargasso Sea. Depending on the location, the sex, eels can take between 5 and 20 years or more to reach maturity. Next slide. As part of the assessment, the U.S. Geological Survey led a pilot effort to assess the eel stock using GIS-based habitat models, and that work will be published separately from the assessment report in a report by U.S. Geological Survey, and the work was led by John Young. The pilot effort focused on the data-rich areas of the Chesapeake Bay and Delaware Bay watersheds. Eel occurrence records were collected for both watersheds, including freshwater areas, and the eel occurrence and abundance was evaluated against a suite of environmental predictor datasets, including dams, connectedness to the ocean, temperature, substrate, and watershed use. USGS was able to develop a spatial model for eels from 1995 into 2019, and they found that fragmentation from dams was a major factor in determining eel distribution within those watersheds. Unfortunately, with reliable data only going back to 1995 and the lack of historical data does not allow us to fully understand the impact and habitat restrictions caused by dams on the population. Further, the lack of eel data in other portions of its geographic range make assessing the larger eel stock challenging with this particular assessment method. Next slide. Moving on to landings, this graph depicts the coast-wide yellow eel landings in millions of pounds. Landings from 1998 to 2020 were validated through ACCSP. The red line indicates the coast-wide landings cap that's currently in place, set at 916,473 pounds. Next slide. For glass eel landings, the glass eel fishery is currently prohibited in all states except for Maine and South Carolina. Maine has had a quota since 2014 with the adoption of Addendum 4, and that quota is 9,688 pounds. South Carolina does have some landings, but they're low since 2015 and remain confidential. In this graph that's provided by the Maine Department of Marine Resources, it shows glass eel landings in thousands of pounds in the gray bars, with price per pound shown with the black line. The glass eel quota here is shown in the red line. Information on recreational catch is derived from the Marine Recreational Information Program, or MRIP. MRIP is designed to provide estimates of marine recreational fisheries catch and effort data. The orange bars in this graph depict the number of individuals that were released alive. The blue bar depicts the number of eels that were removed from recreational harvest. Generally, the MRIP database has a low number of records for American eel, which is less than 0.5% of the trips that are in that database encounter eel. And the MRIP doesn't typically cover the geographic areas or gear that may be relevant to eel. There's also low precision associated with a time series with a percent standard area of error of greater than 50%. And the MRIP query tool itself presents a warning for any PSE values that are greater than 30%. So although this is the best information the SAS has available for recreational landings, there is not high confidence that the MRIP survey adequately assesses recreational effort and removals. That said, it's unlikely that there are significant removals from the recreational fishery compared to that of the commercial fishery. Moving on to fishery independent indices, there's a large number of data sets that were evaluated by the SAS, and we use a suite of criteria to each data set to determine whether or not it would be included in the assessment, and those criteria are listed on the slide. In the end, a total of 49 data sets were retained for assessment. The evaluation of the YOY, or young of year, and yellow eel data are presented in the following slides. The ELVR data were not used in modeling, but additional information on those 10 indices can be found in the assessment report. Next. We'll start with the YOY indices. The SAS evaluated 25 different young of year indices. The individual indices listed here are ranging from north to south. So on the top of the slide are the northern indices, and the bottom of the slide are the southern indices. The surveys were standardized for environmental variables, and trends in individual surveys were derived using the Mann-Kendall non-parametric test for monotonic trend. This is the same method that was used to evaluate trend surveys in the 2012 and 2017 assessments. The right column indicates the trend for the respective survey. So note that NS indicates no significant trend. In the YOY surveys, there are 2 surveys that had increasing trends, 5 surveys with decreasing trends, and the remaining 18 surveys had no trend. Next slide. This graph depicts the abundance of American eel YOY using the MARS index. The MARS is a multivariate autoregressive state space. It's a package in R. And this method can determine long-term population trends among multiple time series, assuming each time series represents the same population. So in this case, we're representing a single population. It's a panmictic population of American eel. Note that the MARS scales to the first survey that's inputted into the code, so the y-axis units are not meaningful on these slides. And also note that the surveys show a declining trend partway through the time series with more stable levels in recent years. We now have two decades worth of data from the state-mandated YOY surveys. Most of those surveys started in 2000 or 2001. And an evaluation was conducted to see if there were latitudinal or temporal patterns in those surveys. We found no patterns on the data on pigment stage, on weights, or recruitment over time. But there was an increase in length and latitude with those surveys. The SAS recommend that the biological sampling of the young of year become optional, so the measuring of length and pigment stage for those YOY surveys is optional, although many of the states have indicated that they will continue to voluntarily collect this information. However, all states are required to continue to do their YOY surveys moving forward. All right, moving on to yellow eels, we're looking at the indices here for yellow eels. The yellow eel surveys were standardized, again, using the Mann-Kendall test, and it assessed 14 different eel surveys for this assessment. 2 of those surveys had increasing trends, 4 surveys had decreasing trends, and the remaining 8 surveys had no trends. And again, in this graphic, the surveys in the north are at the top of the slide and moving south to the bottom of the slide. The Mars index was used to combine the different yellow eel indices to develop a coast-wide index. This index indicates a high abundance of yellow eels earlier in the time series, followed by a decline for the late 1980s and early 1990s, and then a more recent decline since 2009. The SAS considered several assessment methods that were reviewed and attempted during this benchmark assessment. Some were based on the recommendations of the prior peer review in 2012, and some showed potential for being useful to eel. In the end, several assessment methods were identified, and those here in italics did not produce meaningful results and were not useful for determining stock status or giving management advice. So they won't be mentioned further in this presentation, but there is information on these assessment methods in the report. The Mars and Mann-Kendall tests were used to develop indices and describe trend analyses that we discussed in the previous slides. The regime shift analysis, delay difference model, and index-based assessments will be described in the next slides. The first assessment was a regime shift analysis, and this shows the young of year analysis for the regime shift. It was used to identify potential change points in the population and group years together that had similar index values, and it was based on the Mars index. For YOY, the analysis indicates there are 3 different regimes, with higher abundance from 1987 to 2002, followed by a reduced abundance from 2003 to 2008, and then another reduction from 2009 to 2020. The index has generally been in a low regime since 2003. Moving on to yellow eels for the regime shift. The yellow eel time series also supports 3 different regimes, with an initial high level from 1974 to 1988, followed by a large drop that includes 2 lower regimes from 1989 to 2020. This yellow eel regime shift output was later used in the assessment by assigning the high regime time period from 1974 to 1988 as a reference period for calculating abundance when we use the I-target method that we'll talk about shortly. The delay difference model was recommended by the 2012 peer review and is a variation of the biomass dynamic model that includes biological parameters and is fitted directly to the time series and accounts for changes in growth and recruitment over time. It predicts the biomass of an age-structured population directly from the previous year's biomass based on parameters for survival, growth, and recruitment. The SAS developed the model, ran several sensitivity runs and associated reference points, but we do not recommend this model's use for management at this time. The model was developed using an average eel, which was based on Chesapeake Bay data. We don't have enough data coast-wide to adequately describe the large differences observed in sex, growth, size, and behavior along the Atlantic coast, or even between coastal and freshwater habitats. The model was also developed for combined sexes because we didn't have enough data to differentiate between the sexes. Though we know that growth rates and size of maturity vary greatly between male and female eels. Ultimately, the model's parameterization of growth and length at maturity were unrealistic, so the model and its reference points are not recommended for management use by the SAS at this time. Index-based methods is an approach to assess stocks when traditional stock assessment approaches to set catch limits cannot be used or otherwise fail. These methods have been in simulation tested and are based on the work by the Northeast Fisheries Center in 2020 and Carruthers et al. In 2015. The SAS evaluated several index-based methods in the assessment and focused specifically on developing an I-target for the American eel. The SAS was able to choose a reference period, and that was derived from the regime shift analysis I talked about earlier, and it only required input of catch and abundance, which was available for American eel in this assessment. The I-target used the Mars yellow eel index and the yellow eel landings information. It worked by comparing the average index value for the past 3 years to a defined reference period. The I-target is defined by the average index taken during the reference period. In this case, the reference period was from 1974 to 1988. That was derived during the regime shift analysis that we presented earlier. and then it's multiplied by an iTarget multiplier. This multiplier is selected based on a biomass target compared to the biomass of the reference period. So if you select a multiplier of 1, that means that you're shooting to have a biomass target equivalent to the reference period. If you pick something larger than 1, then you're looking to have a higher biomass than what occurred during the reference period. The NOAA work recommends using a multiplier of 1.5, which means the biomass during the reference period was half of what our target biomass would be. The staff settled on something a little bit less than 1.5. We used 1.25 as our multiplier, recognizing that the stock was exploited during the reference period, so it was appropriate to set a biomass target higher than the index during the reference period. Next slide. The next step with iTarget is to develop a threshold. So the threshold is calculated by taking 80% of the target value that is developed using the iTarget method that we just talked about. And that 80% value is recommended from the Northeast Fisheries Center 2020 document. And then catch recommendations are based on where the current 3-year average of the index falls relative to the target and threshold values. So I'll show some examples of this in a minute. But if the index falls below the threshold, the recommended catch will be further reduced compared to what it would have been if it would have been between the index and the threshold values. Next slide. So this slide depicts the actual coastwide yellow eel landings in the black line against the Mars yellow eel index in the blue line. The gray box here depicts the reference period based on the regime shift analysis from 1974 to 1988. The gray dashed line is the iTarget value, which is the average index value from the reference period for the time from 1974 to 1988, and it's multiplied by 1.25. So that's the gray dashed line that we have here. And then the threshold value is 80% of the target value. So that's indicated here by the orange line. So catch advice is developed by comparing the average catch over the reference period and adjusting it by comparing the current average index to the iTarget and iThreshold values. So in years where the index is below the iThreshold, which is the entire time series depicted here on this graph, the recommended harvest level is further reduced because of low stock abundance. This slide compares actual harvest in the black line to what the recommended harvest levels would have been, assuming different biomass targets based on the average index from the high regime as indicated in the blue, red, and yellow lines. To maintain a biomass target of the high regime from 1974 to 1988, the blue line indicates the level of harvest that should have occurred. That was that multiplier 1.0, and it's the least conservative recommendation for harvest. To allow for some higher biomass than what was available during the high regime period, then the 1.25 and 1.5 lines, which are red and yellow, should have been considered for harvest recommendations. Note that the SAS favored the multiplier 1.25, which is the red line, because the stock had a reduced carrying capacity during the reference period. And the takeaway point here is that regardless of the multiplier that is used, which represents the level of biomass we're trying to achieve or maintain, the actual landings have exceeded the value recommended by iTarget for the entire time series depicted here, except for 2020. And 2020 was an anomalous harvest year with COVID. So the conclusion here on the index-based methods is the 3-year average of the Mars index in 2020, which is the last year of assessment, was below the threshold and indicates that the stock is overfished. Although the iTarget method is not well suited to determine overfishing, the fact that removals or harvests have always been more than the recommended removals of this model, that could be viewed as overfishing is occurring. So with the limitations of iTarget, we can state that overfishing status is unknown but likely. Next. Neither the 2012 or 2017 benchmark and update were able to define stock status. There was a lack of quantitative reference points and data limitations. But a depleted status was assigned to previous assessments, and depleted is defined as low levels of abundance, but it is unclear if fishing mortality is the primary cause of the reduced stock size. The stock was at historic low levels, but other factors could have contributed to that status, including historical overfishing, habitat loss, food web alterations, predation, turbine mortality, environmental changes, toxins, contaminants, and disease. Next slide. With the current assessment, based on the iTarget method, the stock is overfished, and based on the Mars index, it has been in decline for multiple decades. The stock is currently at its lowest abundance in the time series. Although other assessment methods were not covered in detail in this presentation, they generally support that the population is currently at low levels, and some methods point to a continued decline in the stock. Overfishing cannot be determined, but is likely given the removals compared to the I-target recommended removals. Based on this assessment, the SAS recommends that yellow eel removals should be reduced. With respect to the next benchmark and updates, we recommend that we stay on the current schedule for benchmarks and assessment updates. So in 5 years, we would do an update assessment, and in 10 years, another benchmark assessment for American eel. And there are research recommendations that are listed both in the 2012 and 2017 benchmark and updates that remain important for American eel, but some of those recommendations are pulled out into the new 2022 assessment as highlights that will improve the next assessment. And I won't go through those here, but you can reference the document for that. In conclusion, eels are a difficult species to assess as their life history strategies and panmictic nature do not conform well to traditional stock assessment methods. That said, the SAS made progress toward providing advice on stock status with this assessment. Young of year abundance has been in a lower regime essentially since the beginning of the mandated YOY surveys by the states, which has been in place for nearly 2 decades. The SAS recommends that the biological sampling of the YOY catch, including length and pigment stage, no longer be required to be collected. The GIS-based habitat models may be an alternative to traditional stock assessment methods, but it will be difficult to assess habitat availability beyond the current habitat use, given the lack of historical data and more generally the lack of data across the species' entire range. Abundance indices are more robust with each assessment iteration as the time series gets longer, and the trends for both YOY and yellow eel indicate that they have been in low abundance for recent years. All analyses considered in this benchmark assessment suggest that American eel is at a very low population level. Some analyses point to continued decline in recent years, and the MARS indicates that the stock is at its lowest point in the time series. The population continues to be in depleted status from historic levels. The I-target assessment method found that the stock status was overfished, being below all thresholds examined, and it is likely experiencing overfishing for the last several decades. And given these persistent results of low abundance and that the stock is likely overfished, the findings of this assessment would recommend reducing the coast-wide quota for yellow eels. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Sheila. That was an excellent presentation and a tremendous amount of work. The next presentation will be the peer review report by Jared Flowers.
Hi there, can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Well, thank you for having me today. I'm going to talk about the eel stock assessment review panel report. Next slide. So just to give you a general overview of the process, the American Eel Stock Assessment Subcommittee and TC developed a new stock assessment, in which there was the ASMSC peer review workshop held December 2022, where results were presented to the peer review panel. And with a scientific review focused on data inputs, model results, and the overall quality of the assessment. And from that, we produced the ASMSC stock assessment and peer review report. And those are available on the council website or commission website. Next slide. So the peer review panel consists of the chair and 2 additional technical reviewers with expertise in eel biology and population dynamics, stock assessment modeling, and survey index standardization. I served as chair, and Dr. Hilaire Druneau from the National Research Institute in Bordeaux, France, and Dr. Robert Lee from the University of Southern Miss Gulf Coast Research Lab were also on the panel. I want to acknowledge their work in this and also acknowledge Pat and commission staff for their guidance in this process. Next slide. So the overall findings of review panels. First, the review panel endorses and supports the I-target approach for formulation of reference points for the fishery, but we do believe additional work is needed to establish sound reference points. We recommend a formal robustness test of the index method using the simulation approach. 2, it is more appropriate to consider the American eel stock to be depleted rather than overfished. The review panel is uncomfortable with overfish terminology because of uncertainty in the assessment methods and does not believe a reliable status determination can be made at this time. 3, future assessments should focus on methods directly resulting in catch recommendations, specifically index-based methods, including iTarget and stage-based delay difference models being the most promising in this report for management advice. Therefore, habitat modeling for eels shows promise for understanding changes in carrying capacity and other spatial dynamics of the stock, and has delivered promising results for other eel species internationally, notably New Zealand and I believe Europe. Preliminary habitat work during this assessment should be further explored down the road. Good. Next slide. So I'm going to go through the review findings based on each tour. So tour number 1, evaluate the definition of stock structure. The panel concludes that we agree with assessing American eel at the coastwide scale because of the panic-dick nature of the species. The distribution extends beyond the United States Atlantic coast. So ideally, it would be nice to conduct stock assessments at a larger scale, beyond the coast. But for this, it's appropriate. And the majority of data originate from coastal areas where most of the commercial fishery takes place. However, the species occupies many other areas and habitats, including freshwater areas and other ocean areas. So our first recommendation is continue to expand data collection analysis, the Canadian, Gulf of Mexico, and Caribbean regions, recognizing the jurisdictional responsibilities for managing American eel. The SAS did use data for fisheries in the Gulf of Mexico and the Canadian region, although the landings were not comprehensive, but they definitely were important. Recommendation 2, encourage future data collection and analysis of American eel and freshwater habitats, including the habitat modeling. Next slide. So tour 2, evaluate thoroughness and treatment of data used in the assessment. The panel concluded that the data sets used were comprehensive and appropriate for the stock assessment, and all potential data sources were requested and used were appropriate. The broad distribution of eel makes it difficult to collect representative relative abundance data. So our first recommendation was to take steps to account for audit correlation and index standardization efforts. The results we do think are unlikely to drastically change, and the recommendation is partially addressed by the inclusion of Julian day as a variable here. Recommendation 2, add more information about data standardization, including tables and figures to improve the understanding and visualization of the standardized framework and results. And we do think the methods used were appropriate, but it'd be nice if there were more detail provided. Next slide. So tour 3, evaluate methods and models used to estimate population parameters and reference points. The panel concluded that the SAS carried out comprehensive review of biological parameters for American eel used in the analysis, and the SAS used the best scientific knowledge available for the assessment. The SAS tested several stock assessment methodologies, both updating formerly used tools in previous assessments and testing new approaches that are novel. These efforts were used thoroughly and well executed. The aggregate indices per life stage using the MARS method are currently the best available coastwide indices and can be used to indicate stock abundance variation over time. And the index-based methods and stage-based delay difference modeling were demonstrated to have the most potential for management advice. And we don't have recommendations necessarily for this, but they're kind of embedded in some of the other tours. Next slide. Tour 4, evaluate the methods used to characterize uncertainty. The panel found that multiple models are evaluated by the SAS to determine fishery and stock reference points. And these are surplus production, egg recruit model, and delay difference models. And each of these approaches, for various reasons, given poor or lack of fit, were unable to provide useful or reliable results. Both the review panel and the SAS agree that the surplus production model was not suitable for use. And the egg per recruit model can derive reference points of value on local scales where yellow and glass eel fisheries coexist, but the review panel considered that the egg per recruit approach was theoretical and caution should be used when interpreting results on a broader scale. The recommendation here is that the delay difference model is the only non-index-based model with potential. More model development is needed to account for variability and uncertainty in eel life history characteristics across this range. Next slide. So tour 5, evaluate the diagnostic analyses performed. The SAS performs some useful diagnostic analyses, and the review panel concludes the diagnostic are insufficient to produce reliable reference points. The SAS systematically varied the iTarget note parameter, representing the relationship of the reference period and biomass target from 1 to 1.5, with 1.25 being what was used. And the SAS bootstrap predicted the confidence intervals of the Mars time series and used the resulting time series of the target method. However, the bootstrapping approach is not ideal as it ignores autocorrelation in the data. So the review panel recommends the development of a MSE style or MSE simulation model to test the robustness of the assessment method, being the index method, and assessment frequency, also the harvest control rules associated, including setting the catch limits based on the assessment results. Next slide. Tour 6 evaluates stock status determination and reference points used by the assessment. The panel concludes that the term depleted is appropriate to describe stock biomass for yellow eel. Note depleted is only used as a descriptor and not a status determination. And it's based on the SAS suite of modeling approaches derived from the close-wide index of abundance. The iTarget approach does not allow determination of stock or fishery status with respect to traditional MSY-based biological reference points. Given that a catch advice from iTarget, an evaluation should be performed to understand if the following catch advice will result in stock biomass increases. So that kind of goes back to the modeling I mentioned in the last tour. But for the recommendation, further evaluate the robustness of catch advice developed from iTarget and recognition of process error associated with eels' complex life history. A significant portion of the stock is outside of the assessed area. Anthropogenic impacts other than fishery affecting the stock. The focus on yellow eel in the iTarget approach versus excluding the other life stages, and also the error associated with landings data. Next slide. Tour 7, evaluate the incorporation of new information with attempts at novel approaches to assess the stock. We did conclude that the SAS should be commended for incorporating many new methods and information into the assessment that weren't available previously. The SAS has done an excellent job developing and updating the indices and documenting the changes in the individual surveys over time. Dealing with 80 indices is definitely commendable. The Mars delay difference and index-based methods incorporated relatively new or methodologies, or they updated previous assessment approaches using new developments or technology. So recommendation here is continue updating and refining the assessment approaches and continue to improve the favored approaches identified by the SAS and review panel. Next. Tour 8, review research recommendations. So research recommendations, the surplus production model and the TLA assessment, the traffic light assessment approaches should be discontinued. Based on the findings, these weren't as useful as the other preferred methods. So future efforts should focus on the index-based method and stage-based delay difference models. Habitat modeling should be explored in future assessments to understand changes in carrying capacity and other spatial dynamics of the spot, and also to promote international collaborations. The panel agrees with the SAS and TC recommendation to make optional the biological sampling requirement for family year surveys. And with the observed climate-induced changes in environmental conditions that have been noted in the North Atlantic, this might be influencing population productivity and abundance. And some of the timing of this coincides with what was seen in the regime shift analysis, and this should be considered in future assessments. Next slide. Tour 9, recommend timing of next benchmark assessment. The panel concludes that the next benchmark assessment should be conducted after additional data are collected and progress is achieved in addressing the review panel's analytical recommendations at a minimum of 5 years, consistent with EEL's long generation time. And this is, I think, was relatively the same recommendation as made previously. But we do recommend pursuing international assessments, including Caribbean, Canadian, Gulf of Mexico input. The panel applauds the inclusion of the Canadian and Gulf of Mexico data in this current assessment, but we really think future assessments would benefit from participation from areas in the range. Okay, next slide. And I think I'm going to pass it on the questions at the end.
Thank you, Jared. Excellent presentation. Our next presenter will be Kristen Anston for the commission.
Thank you. I just have a few slides about potential paths forward for accepting this assessment and moving forward with how to manage this stuff. I first want to reiterate that the SAS and the peer review panel agree on a lot of things, and that the peer review workshop was really productive, and we have some really meaningful recommendations with how to continue to assess EEL for the next benchmark. The peer review panel said the MARS index was currently the best available coastwide index for EEL, and they did endorse the use of iTarget for managing EEL. But in the report, as you just saw, the panel concluded that more work is needed to test that robustness of the iTarget method using the MSE approach before it could be used for management. So the SAS has met a couple times since we received the peer review report a couple weeks ago to discuss this path forward. And ultimately, this is where we start to differ from the peer review panel. The SAS does not think the MSE simulation work will be a productive or timely exercise for EEL for a few reasons. Part of an MSE will be developing an operating model, and that's going to be challenging and time-consuming and may require outside expertise to complete. The methods from the research track paper, the Northeast Fisheries Science Center paper with the index-based methods, were designed as a Plan B approach that can be used when assessment models fail, such as our delay difference model, or when there are strong retrospective patterns. And we argue that the iTarget method was already simulation tested under different life histories. Now, those life histories are different from those of EEL, but what makes EEL different are the very things that SAS is unsure of and that we struggle to model in the delay difference approach. That's not to say there's not some room to test this method. So in the last few weeks, the SAS began work on doing some bootstraps around the index, subsampling the indices, and some of the other recommendations that are in that peer review report to kind of test some of the decisions we made and how that might influence the recommendations coming out of iTarget. So we have been working on that and kind of thinking that through. There are also different formulations of the iTarget that could be explored, and likely changing some of the decisions within iTarget, like the multiplier, the reference period, the percent to set your threshold, will result in bigger differences than some of this index work, but they're both potential paths forward to kind of see how sensitive this tool would be for management. Next slide. So the SAS and staff has been discussing possible paths forward. So first, the board could choose status quo to maintain the current management under Addendum 5 and maintain that 916, 473-pound coastwide yellow cap. Option 2 could be to task the SAS with exploring some simulation work like we've been doing on the indices and around iTarget and different management strategies, such as the desire to rebuild the stock back to that reference period or maintain the stock where it currently is, depending on the board's goals for this fishery. Or option 3 would be to do the MSE and simulation work as recommended by the peer review panel. The SAS believes that work is significant enough to be another benchmark. So we had said the next benchmark would be in 10 years, or the board, it's the will of the board to ask for an assessment whenever you want one. So depending on the full stock assessment schedule at the commission, that could be put in place if that's the path that we go. The last 3 assessments have continued to find EEL at its lowest abundance, and the SAS does not support the status quo option. And we have reservations about option 3, as I discussed previously. Next slide, please. So ultimately, there are some disagreements between the SAS and the peer review panel about the path forward. The commission's guidance document does address this, so I just want to put a slide up about what we say for scenarios like this. So in cases where a SAS and peer review panel do not agree, we present both reports to the board as we have done today, and the board can task the SAS or the technical committee with providing justifications for why they don't agree with the advice given and ask them to provide alternate analyses at a later date. Then the SAS OTC would do that work, produce a report or a memo, and we could bring it back to the board to make a final determination on status and management at a future meeting. Next slide. If the board is interested in that tasking and that option 2 that the SAS laid out where we do some additional work, then the staff has discussed that, and we would recommend that we postpone accepting this document until a later date when we bring that work back. If the board accepts the reports today, that would indicate the board agrees with the path forward proposed by the peer review panel and wants to pursue the MSE simulation work. So hopefully that'll help some of the discussions that we'll probably have now about how to proceed with the stock assessment and managing the species. Thank you.
Thank you, Kristen. All right, I would like to open it up to questions for our presenters.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks to the Stock Assessment Committee and the peer review for that excellent information, but that's a heck of a lot of information we just got here. Trying to go back to the presentation that Sheila gave, I noticed that it looked like the regime shift pretty much started around the same time we started state surveys in 2000. So clearly there was a lot more data going forward from that point. How much of an impact did that have on the changes that were seen in the survey, in the trend, by having the extra data?
So for the yellow eel index, the peer review panel did ask us to produce some plots, which we have since added to the benchmark that compare each individual index to the overall trend. So you can see that for yellow eels, for example, Maine through Delaware are pretty in step with that long range, the long trend and the different shifts around in time. And then there are a couple indices, and we can see it in Mankendall as well, that there's a couple indices that are increasing, and that's not captured as much by that long-term index. So it does matter, and that could be part of the simulation work, is kind of showing the board more how the choice of indices varies. Unfortunately, the time of the indices is what we have, and of course we want all of the indices to go back farther in time, but we just don't have that level of data.
Just a quick follow-up on that. I mean, some of those, having done the survey myself for many years with the glass eels, I know that, they vary a lot from year to year. Does that have a lot to do with the non-significance in the trends you're seeing? Because, I mean, we'd go from, close to 1 million to maybe 100,000 the next. So it's quite a shift.
Absolutely. That's what we're seeing. These indices are just wildly variable. There does seem to be an overall trend that we can pull out of putting them all together, but they are very noisy indices, the young eater.
Thank you, John. Lynn,
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all of you for all of this work. This is a vexing species and a vexing topic, so I really appreciate your work. I'm trying to understand, so there are several phrases that I heard during these presentations. So there's regime shift, there's carrying capacity, and then there's reference period. And it sounded to me like the habitat analyses that were done may start to point to a little more clarity about what's happening with carrying capacity. So I'm wondering if you can help us understand a little bit. We've got this reference period set very early when abundances were high. So what is the conversation around reconciling a regime shift, a changed carrying capacity, and where your reference period is to guard against setting a reference period that's just now completely unattainable, but also recognizing the whole shifting baseline idea. So I'm just curious, you hate to set expectations that are just too high to achieve. So thanks.
With respect to carrying capacity specifically, so the habitat analysis that was done, which was focused on the Chesapeake and Delaware Bay areas because we had most data from that geographic area, but it does indicate that the presence of dams is what is restricting eel abundance. And I think that probably holds true coast-wide, even though the analysis did not encompass the entire coast. That said, the regime shift indicates that the high abundance that we have in the time series is from the late 70s to the early 80s. And when you talk about dam construction was done well prior to that time period. So if we're talking about habitat restriction, that occurred many decades before the high reference period. So I think from a carrying capacity standpoint, that isn't the issue, that we're in a low abundance state at this point. And I would follow that up with, in the last 15 to 20 years, there's been a heck of a lot of work by the states and federal government to open up new habitat. So there's been a lot of dam removals, water quality improvements, and other work that's been done to improve habitat across the eel range. And because they encompass both freshwater and estuary areas, the work of the habitat that has been done in the last 2 decades should theoretically be opening up habitat for eel to increase our carrying capacity, and that's not being translated in the Mars Index.
Okay, thank you. Craig Pugh.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question is, I didn't see, as we watch these regime changes and population changes over those time periods, I don't know as if there was any incorporation with the effort involved. I know in our area, marketability at this time has decreased significantly over the last 20, 25 years. Also eliminating the effort put forward and lowering the catch data. So that would have a significant play through the year periods. I was active in the fishery myself through the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s. Not so much anymore, like I say, because marketability has dropped off so much. So where is the relationship here with the reduction in catch effort? Thank you.
So with respect to the regime shift analysis, that is based on fishery independent surveys. So it's not based on catch and effort data. It's based on those indices that are conducted by the states and other agencies. So that should not be driven by the fishery itself and the economic drivers of the fishery.
I find that odd if the effort has dropped off and if the analysis has taken the historical values of that data, then it should be recognized in some kind of incorporation in this. I don't necessarily agree with that analysis. I don't see where we get a clear picture unless we have a clear picture of what the true effort is on the East Coast, which, and I know in our area, it's somewhat analytical, but it seems as though our eels have increased as a bycatch in our blue crab fishery. But yet we still show these as depleted, even though we're seeing increases on a daily basis in our local areas. But yet we know that the marketability has caused a lack of effort on the part of the eel fishermen. Not only just a lack of effort, but I'd say the loss of eel fishermen also in the area has been significant. Thank you.
Yeah, we have some fishery dependent indices in the appendix of the assessment that can be viewed, and those were supplied by various states. We don't have an analysis on effort. I will say that there were representatives on the SAS and the TC that discussed this a little bit, that in their waters, they're not seeing what we're seeing at a coastwide level. And so that is something we should probably address now, which is the SAS has discussed this over and over. We know that Maryland and Delaware aren't seeing decreases in their catches or their indices. And we talked about this as a SAS and kind of the phenomenon of hyperstability where, you know, a stock can collapse to the center of its range, and that is the center of its range. And we can have a depleted stock where in the middle, you're still seeing high catches, you're still seeing high CPUE, and the indices are fine. And you can see that in the Maryland index specifically, not as much in the Delaware, but that Maryland index continues to be fine, as well as their reported effort by their fishermen. So it is something we've discussed. I guess the argument is we saw this, for example, with northern shrimp, where their indices and their catch were fine until they weren't. And so that's kind of the concern. This is all one stock. So if it's a depleted stock and it continues to decline and decline, you'll start to see that focus into the center of the range. And the fear is that that could be what we're seeing now.
Okay, we have Robert LaFrance online, and we'll come back to the room. Russell Dies.
Hey, thank you very much. Excellent presentations, really fantastic information. I just want to follow up a little bit more on this issue of a GIS-based or spatially based analysis. I've heard a lot of discussion back and forth, but I don't know exactly what we would be doing from a recommendations perspective to pursue those types of efforts. And I'm wondering if you might be able to give us some insight as to what you'd be looking to do in those areas and how much time that might take. I know there's some historical problems with historic data, but if we don't start collecting data at some point in time, we'll never really know what's going on. Thanks, appreciate any response.
So just clarity on the question, is that what would a habitat model bring us in the future if we continue to develop it? Is that the question?
Exactly.
Well, I think firstly, it's important to note that developing the habitat model further is going to be very challenging for eel because we have a lot of data on eel and their distribution in the mid-Atlantic area, but we don't have that information in other parts of the coast. And because this is a pandemic stock, really, we should be looking at its entire range, and we really don't have information from that perspective. I think it gives us a sense of carrying capacity. Like I said, that assessment based on the mid-Atlantic at least shows that dams are a driving factor in where eels are distributed in the basin. That's not a surprise. I personally am concerned that that type of habitat assessment isn't going to give us the information we need to manage eel stocks, particularly those that occur in the estuary, because that habitat model is going to focus on a lot of habitat that is not under the jurisdiction of many of the agencies that are at this table today.
But I guess to follow up on that, if you don't mind, but to the extent that we do have additional information further coastwide, more than just the mid-Atlantic, maybe up into New England at least, shouldn't we be collecting more data and getting that data set ready for the future?
I think potentially that could be useful. It was a recommendation by the peer review to develop the habitat assessment model further, and we can consider that with the assistance of the U.S. Geological Survey.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Russell, and then John Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate all the work that's being done, but I don't understand one thing, and that's when you did the assessment on yellow eels, you did 3 assessments in the Hudson River area, and you only did 1 in the bay. And in the bay, Chesapeake Bay, in the bay, you did the assessment in the Sassafras River. The Sassafras River is all the way up towards the Conowingo Dam, and it's heavily predated by blue catfish. Had you have done assessments, if you'd have done more assessments in Maryland part of the bay and in my area, which is Tillman Island, and I talk with eel fishermen all the time. We've lost all of our eel fishermen in the middle part of the bay because we can't sell the eels anymore. All the crabbers have gone to clams, and the overseas market has dried up for yellow eels. But I don't understand why you would do twice as many tows in the or assessments more in the Hudson River area than you did in the Chesapeake Bay. And when you did it in Chesapeake Bay, you did it in an area where probably the predation of blue cat is worse than anywhere else except maybe the Potomac River. And we have lost our eel fishermen. They can't fish anymore around us. We have so many yellow eels in our area that one of my fellow watermen sent an eel out a eel pot out to catch some small eels for trolling for rockfish. And it filled, the pot filled with yellow eels. We're not catching them. And I don't see why that that we don't take all this in. When you're just taking 4 assessments for the whole East Coast for yellow eel, I don't think you're doing justice to the survey by not doing more in the Chesapeake Bay area, especially in our area. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, I think Kristen and I are going to split the response to that. First, I want to speak to the blue catfish issue specifically. In the Chesapeake Bay, the blue catfish issue is relatively recent, especially in the Upper Bay around the area of the Sassafras River. They've been recently established. So as far as the length of the survey, it really would have only impacted the survey in the last few years. So it's an interesting prospect. We do know that blue catfish do consume American eel. The population explosion in the Chesapeake Bay and potentially into the Delaware Bay is a concern for the species to increase predation. That doesn't speak specifically to where the surveys are located and why that's located. I'm going to have Kristen speak to that.
Yep, so as Sheila covered in her presentation, we had about 80 fishery independent data sets that were submitted for consideration, and we dug into each of them to see, can we develop an index from this data? So the indices that you see in the assessment were the ones that we thought were tracking American eel, or we could develop an abundance index out of them. So of course, we would like more indices everywhere. The Maryland index was included, as you noted. We also have a couple from VIMS in Virginia. Unfortunately, they have a gear change in the early part of the time series. So while we did use them to also describe the yellow eel population, they don't go as far back as the Hudson River indices. And so, of course, it would be great to be able to pull that index back. And we have the full time series in the benchmark, and it's a pretty similar trend from those VIMS surveys at that historic time period, but it's a gear change, so it's not really fair to include it. We would like them all to go back to the 70s, so we could do that. The Hudson River indices, yes, they are historic indices at this point. They go back the farthest in time, and they do have an influence on that overall trend. Although the trends are pretty consistent through the surveys, with the exception of the Maryland one and the end of one of the VIMS surveys. We can also, if the board tasks us with more work, talk a little bit about the influence of the Hudson River indices. They are driving a lot of that change, and they are historic indices. But, you know, we can work on that if you'd like.
But the Hudson, the survey in the Hudson River skews the whole problem with the yellow eels. Our problem isn't catching, our problem is selling. And I can take you, according to where you do the survey, I can take you where we've had an abundance of oysters in the last 2 years in Chesapeake Bay. I can take you in a spot and survey it, and you say it's the most oysters you've ever seen in your life. I can go 2 miles from that and tell you take a survey, and you say never was an oyster here. It's according to where you take these surveys, and I understand what you're saying, that it's back over a long period of time. But we've been catching eels in Chesapeake Bay over a long period of time also. And I just think that it skews the amount of yellow eels by not doing as many reports in the Chesapeake Bay as you do in the Hudson River, which is on a total decline. And thank you very much. I know you've done a lot of work, but I just think when you're adjusting how many yellow eels can be caught on the whole East Coast, and you're doing major part of it in one area, you're skewing the report. Thank you.
Yeah, noted. I guess the only final thing I would say is this is a single population, and we don't have information on which of these regions are producing the next generation of American eels. So is it the Hudson River or is it the Chesapeake Bay that's feeding our recruitment? We don't know that. And so that is also a challenge when we're modeling.
John Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for allowing me a second question here. But I want to follow up. Kristen, you spoke about the the contraction of the range, but I've been around this long enough. I remember the first assessment in the early 2000s, and that was really instigated by the pretty much total extirpation of eels from the Lake Ontario and Canada's understandable concern there. Yet at that time, I recall in the Canadian Maritimes, they were not seeing really any reduction at all in their yellow eel numbers. And just from my experience with sampling eels in the Delaware, it seems almost like we have two populations. We have an estuarine population that grows quickly. We would rarely age an eel over 5 or 6 years old. Most of the females were out migrating probably by the time they were 5. And yet, when you went inland, I remember, and Sheila, I believe you did work on the Shenandoah, where you saw huge reductions in the silver eels coming out of that system, or even eels getting into that system. And it just seems, is that still something you're seeing, where you're seeing like less change in the estuaries? And, you know, given the life history of eels, it seems like it would be very difficult to understand how the leptocephali would distribute only to the mid-Atlantic rather than the whole range, since they're just kind of drifting on the Gulf Stream before they turn into glass eels and move in. So it's just a very confusing situation. And has that kind of persisted, that same type of pattern?
Yes, we are still struggling with that as a stock assessment group, that eel is just, it behaves so differently depending on where you are, freshwater, estuary, ocean, Maine to Florida. And that's what we came up against in the delay difference model, was how do you describe growth for eel? If this is one stock, you can't. And so that's what we struggle with when we're thinking about the MSE simulation. Yeah, we could come up with a bunch of different operating models that are likely representing estuary waters in Delaware and the coastal waters somewhere else, but which one is correct? And we don't know that, and it is a real challenge for eel. I'll just throw in a second plug here, which is we do have an ICES work group for American eel. Sheila and I are both on it, as well as representatives from Maine and North Carolina, and we're partnering with Canada to look at all the data available to eel and talk about these challenges and propose different stock assessment methods that could be used in the future. So internationally, this is a problem, and we're trying to collaborate with people to resolve the very issues you're talking about, but it remains a question mark if we can.
Are there any other? Yes, Christian.
Yes, for option 2, you said that the subgroup could get a report back to this board this year. Do you know when? Summer, annual?
We probably not the next benchmark, maybe later, the one after that, to do the, if you were interested in more simulation work, as well as evaluating the influence of the Hudson, as well as, you know, turning some different knobs within iTarget. I guess it really depends on what the board's interested in seeing.
Shana?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you to the entire SAS as well as the peer review team, Drs. Eiler and Anstead. I really appreciate you guys being here today. This represents an awful lot of work. A lot of times in assessments, we don't get to see all of this background work, all of the different models you attempted and things like that. So I really appreciate the time that you spent on all of these approaches. I kind of have a series of questions, so apologies ahead of time, and you can cut me off whenever you need to, Mr. Chair. My first question is, I'm trying to dig in a little bit between the discrepancies between the peer review as well as the SAS recommendations. And my first question is in regards to the delay difference modeling. So it sounded like as we were going through the peer review report, it is one of the models that the peer reviewers suggested for further development, but then in reading through the stock assessment report, it sounded like the SAS was less enthused, I guess, about that model. Can you talk about some of the differences in why you all believe that that's probably not the best approach to go through at this time?
The delay difference model?
Yes.
Yeah, so the delay difference model has showed the most promise of any analytical model we have tried for eel. And we did develop it as well as develop reference points for it. But the challenge for us became describing growth, for example, as we were just talking about. Describing growth in one area is very different from describing growth in another area. So we came up against a few walls that way with the kind of unique life history of eel. I think both the SAS as well as the peer review panel think there could be more work done. We didn't manage it for this assessment, but if we were to do another benchmark in 10 years, I think that model absolutely is still on the table, but the additional work it might need is a benchmark level kind of what we found here was kind of an initial go at it, but there were so many challenges. It just wasn't recommended for making management advice because of those uncertainties. But I think there could still be room to improve, and the peer review panel made some recommendations we can look into next time that we definitely would.
If you don't mind, follow up. The other question I had was in regards to, and this is more just a characterization so that I can kind of get my mind straight on the differences between the peer reviewers and again, the SAS. So it sounds like both of you sort of coincide with this idea that using this iTarget methodology from the Northeast Fisheries Science Center could be used here for eels, but the place where you just diverged is the level of simulation testing that you think is appropriate. Is that a correct characterization? Like they want to go full-blown MSE, lots and lots of simulation testing, and the SAS is saying, let's take a little bit more of a measured approach and see what some of our simulation testing leads to in option 2. Is that a correct characterization?
Yes, although we can look to Jared if we need to, but I believe it was thought of more of an MSE light. So I just want to make sure not to misrepresent the amount of work. It's still a lot of work, but it might not be as much as other species.
Right, so a diet MSE, if you will. I guess I kind of equate that a bit to what we did for Atlantic Menhaden, not a full-blown MSE, but really having some of the conversations with the management board, the scientists, the technical members to get an idea of where we wanted to go with that species and running the simulation testings that way. So I appreciate that. And then my final question, I think, is in relation to one of the things that Dr. Flowers did bring up. He said that he thought it would be important for us to do an evaluation essentially to see, and I don't think we need to get there just yet, so I know this is a later step in the future, but to do an evaluation essentially to see if our catch advice actually helps to potentially improve our stock biomass. Do you think that that's possible within, we're aiming for this report to come back to the boards at some point during this year, obviously depending on what the board's advice is to the SAS. Is that something that we could pursue later? Do you foresee that sort of being a part of the package that you present back to us in whatever time frame?
We can certainly try, but there is a point that I think directly speaks to that, which is we don't know if iTarget, even if you do the right thing, will necessarily rebuild eel. We don't know if the MSE, what comes out of that, would guarantee a rebuilt eel stock. This is what we think is the most appropriate given this depleted status, that something should be done, and we can try to test the relationship between the recommended catch and land use, but that's not what these index-based methods do. They don't guarantee anything. They're just recommending when you need to set a catch limit and all you have are landings and index, you need to do something. And so this is a method for that.
And I'm finally done. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Roy Moore. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would, since we're on the step of potential next steps, I'd like to explore a little bit the ramifications of depleted status versus overfished. We're not bound to the Magnuson-Stevens Act like the councils are. If this species, if we were to declare this species overfished, like was recommendation of at least part of what was presented today, as opposed to depleted, but there is a subtle difference in terms of how we would proceed. If we declared this species as being overfished, presumably we would be talking about reducing fishing. By depleted, there's no imperative that we consider catch reductions. So where are we? I'm a little confused as to what's the best path forward, and which status are we in, since there was a little bit of difference between the SAS and the peer review panel in that regard. Thank you.
I just want to respond to the question of our obligation at the commission to responding to those two different types of statuses. No, we don't have the same obligation as NOAA Fisheries would to responding to an overfished status and making a rebuilding plan. However, with the other species that we have at the commission that use the depleted status, for example, shad and river herring, we have in the past acted on those statuses and reduced fishing mortality as a result of those. So it is an option, and Tony, I think, has something to add.
And just a reminder why we have these two statuses. We developed these in coordination with the Assessment Science Committee to recognize that there are times when fishing pressure is not the only thing that is causing a stock to not rebuild, but that doesn't mean if there's other pressures, it doesn't mean that there's nothing that the board does in response. It's just recognizing these other factors that are part of its inability to rebuild. But it doesn't just give us a pass to not do anything.
Are there any other questions for the presenters? Lynn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just one quick question. So under option 2, with this simulation, work to explore yellow eel indices and sensitivity of iTarget. So would the board get back, would there be some exploration of changing that reference period? If you set a reference period halfway between, or is that part of it? I just want everyone to be clear that there would be some discussion of what that reference period actually is.
Yeah, if the board's interested in that, we can certainly kind of do two things. One is show the results of this index work that we've been working on that was a recommendation from the peer review panel. We could do that, and then you could see the sensitivity of these indices to, the final decisions. We can also show some different iterations of iTarget if you make different choices to show how different the answer would be. And it is quite different depending on what you choose. So what the SAS formulated in the benchmark was kind of what we thought as the base run, with the intention of PDT taking that and making various decisions for the board to consider.
Are there any other questions online? Shannon.
Just a question of process. Do we need a motion to move forward with one of these options, or is kind of a consensus of the board appropriate here?
I believe we could move forward with consensus from the board. So if the desire is to take the SAS's recommendation to do some additional work under what's presented here as option 2, if we can get consensus on that, we can go forward with that.
Thank you. I will then at least like to speak in support of option 2. I think it's the most measured approach, and I'd really like to give our SAS more time to respond to the comments of the peer reviewers. I think you have really good ideas moving forward. I think Lynn's question feeds into that, getting to see, what comes out of a PDT, what some of the options might look like, changing the multipliers, modifying the time periods, things like that. I think an iterative measured approach is appropriate here. I don't believe that option 1 is appropriate, and I am uncomfortable pursuing option 3 until we see what option 2 kind of provides for us. So that is my recommendation without a motion.
Rick Jacobson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I do want to commend the panel for the tremendous work they've done to evaluate this very complicated species with a complicated life history and geographic distribution. I think the information they presented, quite frankly, has been outstanding. And I understand it's difficult to make decisions in the absence of perfect data and perfect analyses and perfect conclusions. But we've got some really good information in front of us that indicates that if we were in a place where we could define what harvest quotas should be, we're above those, and we've been above them for some time, and the stock has been declining in the wake of all of that. Whether those fishing has been this one specific driver or not is a completely different question. But yet we're still in a place where we need to make a decision today that will affect what happens with the stock tomorrow. I can support option 2, and I appreciate the recommendation coming forward. I would just, I would hope that this is not a measure that just kicks the can down the road, because we do need to make decisions on what levels of harvest are necessary. So I can support option 2. I could also support an option that would pursue option 2 and include some reduction in harvest opportunity. But I agree, option 1 is simply not tenable. Thank you.
I just wanted to provide some additional information on this path that we've proposed for moving forward. And this is something that's part of our technical guidance with the stock assessments. If there is a disagreement in a particular aspect between a stock assessment subcommittee and a peer review panel, there is this process for moving forward where the stock assessment subcommittee can be tasked by the board to put together this type of report that we're suggesting that provides the information the board needs to really make a decision about how to move forward and what parts of what the SOX has recommended versus what the peer review panel has recommended they would like to move forward with. So that's really what we're proposing to put together for the board and bring back to the board at potentially the next meeting to be able to make those types of decisions that Rick Jacobson just mentioned.
Are there any other questions? John Maniscalco.
So given what Caitlin just outlined, would the board have new catch advice in place for 2024? I guess that's my concern.
I think it would be a pretty tough thing to turn around in that amount of time.
Any other questions? We're going to open it up for the public. Kirby?
Can you hear me? Hi, good morning. This is Kirby Ritzmurdy with the U.S. Geological Survey. Good to see some friendly faces around the table. I want to join the chorus and commend the Stock Assessment Subcommittee in doing such a thorough and great job in producing the stock assessment. USGS is at the ready to provide additional analysis support through both the Technical Committee and the SAS, in addition to John Young's GIS habitat modeling work. I would just offer consideration for this board as you're reviewing and thinking about, for example, catch reductions, is to take a step back and consider the species range again. You know, as Kristen noted, there is an ICES work group, there's current collaboration with Canada DFO, as well as coordination with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service outside of those that have worked on the assessment in terms of providing information as part of CITES obligations. For next steps, you know, the U.S. is one of a handful of countries that are harvesting American eel. And so, you know, I would ask that, you know, for you all to consider that in moving forward with any tasking of the TC, when it comes to items around harvest, that you also consider how to continue moving forward with communicating with these other countries in our current framework, whether it's through Fish and Wildlife or other agencies, to ensure that those other countries' catch systems are being considered with any changes you all are considering as well. So, thanks.
Thank you. Is there any other public comment on this agenda item? Okay, we will turn to Rob LaFrance online.
I just wanted to follow up and ask, under option 2, that's where I'm leaning towards as well. When you come back, when they come back either in the either in the annual meeting or when we get back. Will it also include some management recommendations, or still just like trying to get a better understanding of the assessment? I saw something about maybe an amendment recommendation, so I'm just wondering what that meant.
Yeah, what we would bring back to the board would be the additional work we've done on the indices, as well as some additional work we can do on iTarget. I think before we had gone through peer review, the idea was with iTarget that then a PDT would take that and make different decisions possibly than we made, depending on board interests and, put up for public comment. That's not what this task is. This task would give the board clarity on how these tools and indices are operating to make decisions whether to accept this assessment and the peer review report, as well as any future management advice. So this is not equivalent to a draft addendum or any other management document. It's just additional work to help you all choose a path forward. And I think that's why it's unlikely it would provide 2024 catch advice.
Thank you very much.
Are there any other questions? Agreed.
Do you mind if I make a comment, Mr. Chairman? Okay, so at this point, I'd like to move this along, if you don't mind. I support Ms. Madsen's quest for a consensus statement. And, with that, staff is recommending to us that we recommend to them to do what they're asking us to do, which has happened before. So let's move this along and give the staff what it wants and talk about this when we're better informed. That's where I'm at. Thank you.
Is there any disagreement among the members of the board? Okay, we don't have to have a motion. We'll move along with option 2. Malcolm Rhodes.
I agree totally with this. I just want to get an idea of the timetable. Are we looking at the ability to get this done by the summer meeting, by the annual meeting? What would be an acceptable timetable so we have kind of a time certain on the table?
Yes, I think, so the SAS, the TC haven't discussed this at all, and the SAS have had superficial conversations about it, so I think we would aim for summer, annual meeting at the latest.
Thank you.
There's an unlikely chance that we could bring something back to the May meeting, but we'll aim for summer meeting.
Okay, we'll move on to the next item on the agenda. Consider the fisheries management plan review and state compliance for 2021 fishing year. And I'll turn it over to Caitlin Stark.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'll give a brief review of the American Eel FMP review for the 2021 fishing year. I'll start off with just making sure, start off with an overview of the status of the FMP, and I'll skip over the stock status information as we just discussed that. I'll go over the commercial and recreational fishery information for 2021, the state compliance reports, and wrap up with some recommendations from the plan review team. Next slide. So eel are currently managed under Addendum 5 to the FMP, which is what established the coastwide cap for yellow eels of 916,473 pounds. It also maintained the aquaculture provisions that allow the states to harvest up to 200 pounds of glass eel for aquaculture with an approved harvest proposal. And right now, Maine is the only state that has aquaculture harvest, or had in 2021, and they had 138.91 pounds of glass eel harvested for aquaculture. And then per addendum 4, any state that harvests over 750 pounds of glass eel per year must implement a fishery independent life cycle survey. So in that case, Maine did harvest over 750 pounds. and they continued their fishery independent life cycle survey of glass, yellow, and silver eels in 2021, and that's now carried out at West Harbor Pond as of 2019. Next slide. Fishery landings for 2021 reported in the FMP are from the state compliance reports, and the estimated commercial landings for 2021 for yellow and silver eels were approximately 427,000 pounds. And this is a 64% increase from the 2020 landings, which were very low as a result of both COVID-19 as well as market changes. But the 2021 landings are still lower than what we saw in 2019. For 2021, Maryland, Virginia, and New Jersey combined accounted for 87% of the total coastwide 2021 landings. And then for glass eels, Maine and South Carolina are the only states with landings. Maine harvested 9,106 pounds in 2021, which is below their quota of 9,688 pounds. And South Carolina's landings are confidential, but they do remain under 750 pounds, and therefore they do not have to implement that life cycle survey. Recreational harvest estimates are no longer provided in state compliance reports as of 2009, and this is as a result of the MRIP survey design being unsuitable for eel because it does focus on coastal and estuarine fishing sites, and as a result, the PSEs for the MRIP results are very high and unreliable numbers for eel. So for the glass eel fishery, next slide. The FMP and its addenda currently require all of the states to implement young of year surveys to maintain harvest regulations with a limit of 25 pigmented eels per 1 pound of glass eels and 1/8 of an inch mesh. And it also has Maine's glass eel quota, commercial monitoring and reporting, and the life cycle survey for glass eel harvest over 750 pounds. Next slide. The PRT found that there haven't been any changes to the state regulations on these issues, and all states are in compliance with these requirements. Next slide. For the yellow eels, the FMP and addenda require a minimum size limit of 9 inches, a minimum mesh size of 1/2 inch by 1/2 inch, and an escape panel, a recreational bag limit of 25 eel per day, and up to 50 per day allowed for hire crews and captains for bait, the coastwide harvest cap, as well as a 2-year management trigger of a 10% overage of the coastwide cap. Next slide. And again, the PRT found that there haven't been any changes to state regulations, and all states are in compliance with these requirements. And then for silver eel, the FMP requirements are a seasonal closure from September 1 to December 31 with no take except for from baited pots and traps and spears. There was a 1-year exemption for the ware fishery in the Delaware River and its tributaries in New York, which has been continued since 2014, but it is restricted to 9 permits that may be transferred for the New York ware fishery. And the PRT noted one issue regarding silver eels, which is that Florida regulations don't prevent harvest of silver eels from pound nets from September 1st to December 31st, but the state is unaware of any active pound net fishery in the past 10 to 15 years. The FMP also requires at least monthly trip level reporting by both harvesters and dealers, as well as sustainable fishery management plans, including fishing mortality plans, transfer plans for quota from the yellow to glass eel fishery, and aquaculture plans for watersheds that contribute minimally to the spawning stock. And all these plans must scientifically demonstrate that they'll not increase overall fishing mortality on American eel. Next slide. So as I mentioned, Maine is the only state currently with an active aquaculture plan, and they submitted a proposal for the 2022 fishing year, and that was approved by the board in August 2021. Next slide. So the PRT noted a few other issues in the compliance reports just to mention. So first, many states have been unable to provide information on the percent of the commercial harvest of eel that's sold as food versus what's sold for bait. Only Maine, New York, New Jersey, Delaware, and Florida were able to provide this information in 2021. New York was also unable to provide data on the commercial CPUE for the 2021 fishing year, and New Jersey was unable to complete the fishery independent monitoring requirements in 2021 due to some continued COVID-19 restrictions. Next slide. Several states have requested and qualified for de minimis status, and that means that for the life stage for which they're requesting de minimis, the state's average commercial landings for the preceding 2 years have been less than 1% of the coastwide commercial landings for that life stage. So for 2022, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, DC, Georgia, and Florida all requested de minimis status for their yellow eel fisheries. However, Florida's 2021 landings exceeded 1% of the coastwide landings, so they do not qualify for de minimis. The rest of the states that apply do qualify for de minimis status. And under the FMP, de minimis status would exempt a state from having to adopt the commercial and recreational fishery regulations for that particular life stage and the fishery dependent monitoring requirements for that life stage. So if Florida is not granted de minimis status, then the state would need to implement those requirements. Next slide. These are the recommendations from the PRT to the board. I'll note that a number of these have been maintained from last year's report. So first, the PRT recommends the board consider the notes on state compliance that I've given. Note the drop in recent years yellow eel harvest. They also suggested reevaluating the requirement that states provide estimates of the percent of harvest that's for food versus bait. And in addition to that, task the Committee on Economics and Social Science with a market analysis to determine if this information is useful for management and should be collected or not. They also recommend the states continue to work with law enforcement on including information on illegal harvest of eel in the compliance reports, and also recommend New York separate their yellow and silver eel landings in their report if possible. They lastly recommended that states should try to quantify their upstream and downstream passage for eel and provide that information to the TC for evaluation. As we discussed, this would be useful information to have for some habitat analysis. Next slide. So with that, the board action for consideration today is to approve the FMP review and state compliance reports for the 2021 fishing year and de minimis requests from New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, DC, and Georgia for the yellow eel fisheries. And I can take any questions.
Are there any questions for Caitlin? Okay, would somebody be willing to put forward a motion?
John.
Sorry, John.
More comment. So DC is working with U.S. Fish and Wildlife and Cornell University to assess the proportion of eels from the weir fishery that is silver versus yellow, and we hope that that'll be completed soon. So that's ongoing. Thanks.
Thank you. Any other questions? Okay, would somebody be willing to put forward a motion? John Clark.
Yes, I move to approve the fishery management plan review and state compliance for the 2021 fishing year. And is there a motion already made that has all the de minimis in it? Okay. Okay, well, now I'll just read it. Move to approve the American Eel FMP review and state compliance reports for the 2021 fishing year and de minimis requests from New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, District of Columbia, and Georgia for their yellow eel fisheries.
Great, thank you. Is there a second? Doug Grout. Would anyone like to discuss around the motion? Okay, I'll read the motion off the record. Move to approve the American Eel FMP review.
You have a question?
Can we have a question from online or? Erica Burgess.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can we get a clarification on what the actual percentage Florida was of the coastwide landings?
I would have to pull up my Excel spreadsheet for you.
Okay, it would have been helpful to have that in the FMP review.
All right, I can pull that up quickly. If she intends to make any changes.
However, do you plan to make any changes to the motion regarding those numbers?
Yeah, depending on the numbers, I might make a request an amendment to the motion or put a second. I need the class this afternoon to tell me what I'm going to do.
Sorry, give me one moment.
While Caitlin is running numbers, I just wanted to introduce the new ISFMP staff member. She is sitting in the back of the room. Chelsea Tui is back there. She's raising her hand, but she'll stand up. As I said in my email last week, she'll be working on summer flounder, northern shrimp, and scup and bluefish. Please introduce yourself. And Chelsea we're super excited to have her on board. And in addition, the legislative lunch, which I know it's not right now, but just letting everybody know where it is. It's in those two rooms that are that are straight through those doors, which is called Crystal 5 and 6.
So Florida's landings for yellow eel in 2021 were 2.2% of the coastwide landings.
If I can follow up, it's challenging for Florida. We have not had an expansion of our fishery. The resulting increase in share of coastwide landings is actually a result of overall coastwide landings going down. So our fishery is under half of what it was 3 years ago. And it is, the rulemaking in itself, as many states know, is challenging, and to move forward on any additional requirements for not receiving de minimis status would be a challenge.
It's the prerogative of the board whether or not you want to allow another state to have de minimis. You can ask the PRT to say what the implications would or would not be. I recognize that we do have this new de minimis policy, but we wouldn't change any FMP until the board directed that FMP to be changed for the new de minimis policy. If we do move forward with an addendum and that is something that the board wants to do, then we can do that. I would say hold off until we know if you're going to respond to the landings changes on an FMP change, but the boards have approved de minimis status in the past for states that are above. It's the prerogative of the board.
Joe. Thanks. Sorry if I missed this. This is an annual determination then? So in 1 year, out another, there's a potential that they could just be back in de minimis status next year. And then I guess a question maybe for Tony. Was there some recommendation in the de minimis overall policy of looking at like three-year averages and stuff like that?
I need to look it up. It was either 2 or 3 years that we averaged.
And EO uses a 2-year average.
Are there any other questions?
So Joe, it's the threshold in the de minimis policy. It is based on the average of 3 years of landings, and that it's less than 1% of the coastwide landings.
So Mr. Chair, correct me if I'm out of order, but I believe at this point I could offer a substitute motion, which would be to have the motion that's there, but to add Florida to the list of states with the approved de minimis request. Amendment?
Erica, you can make a motion to amend.
Okay, I would like to make a motion to amend to include Florida in the list of states with de minimis status.
Okay, do we have a second? John Maniscalco. Any discussion on this motion? Rick?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Did I just hear two pieces of information? One, that the most recent harvest for Florida was 2-point-something%, and that the policy calls for those that qualify for de minimis status are less than 1% of the coastwide harvest?
Yes. It's less than 1% of the coastwide harvest for the last 2 years, which I'm currently calculating.
The policy is the average of the last 3 years,
But this FMP.
but this FMP uses 2 years.
So would we have to do an addendum to change the average to 3 years, or does the policy supersede what's in the current management plan?
The policy does not supersede the FMP. Changes to the FMP would be made to reflect the policy. But the board still has the prerogative to do something different if they so choose in terms of the approval of these requests.
So just to follow up, I guess what I would, at this point, if we were to support this motion, this amendment were to pass, I would also, I will put in a motion to try and develop an addendum to change the de minimis policy, more reflect the current policy of 3 years, change the management plan so that it reflects a 3-year average.
So just a quick follow-up question on that. Would it be your intention to move forward with such an addendum before we potentially move forward with an addendum to consider changing the coastwide landings cap for yellow eel?
If we were to approve this amendment to allow Florida, could we get a change to, if we were to wait until we had an addendum to change the cap, could we get that done before the next time we have to approve de minimis or not?
That is highly unlikely, given the timeline for an addendum to change the cap would probably take place starting potentially later this year, which is when you would reevaluate de minimis. And just I want to make one more clarification on Florida's current status. So the landings for 2021 and 2020 combined are 1.4% of the total coastwide landings from those 2 years.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I appreciate that clarification, Caitlin. I think it might make others around the table feel more comfortable. I believe it was Delaware that we recently allowed 2 years to go for spot and croaker or one of the species where they were just over. And I believe that this would follow a pattern or a practice that other boards have taken. Thank you.
Lynn?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to speak in favor of the amendment. I think we should be careful about splitting hairs here. And what's interesting is that this is not the result of Florida's fishery growing. This is the result of the total fishery contracting. And Florida maybe just didn't contract quite as fast as everybody else. And when we do this, assuming we're going to set a new cap, everybody's rules are going to change, and that's going to reshuffle. Where our landings are proportionally to everyone all over again. So I think this is a fair addendum to the motion. Thanks.
And just another point, I don't think that we would be able to move super quickly on an addendum for this, because I think that this the TC or the SAS would need to really take some considerations. In addition, in the policy, there are recommendations for sampling requirements, and this species does have sampling requirements for non-de minimis states. And I think it would be important for the TC and SAS to have the time to go through what they would really be recommending states be exempt from and not exempt from if we're going to make a change to the addendum. So. And Erica is correct, spot and croaker have routinely let other states that sort of fluctuate right on the borderline to be de minimis.
Okay, are there any other questions? Okay, I'll read the motion into record. Move to approve the American eel FMP.
To amend.
Well, okay.
Just call the question on the motion to amend.
Okay, just call the question for the motion to amend. Is there any opposition to this motion? Doug Grubb.
Just saying that we have opposition to the motion.
Please raise your hand in opposition of the motion. Could I have the votes in favor? Abstentions?
One. No votes.
No votes. The motion passes, 15 approved, 3 oppositions, and 1 abstention.
And 1 no.
And 1 no.
So now we have to.
Okay, I'll read the motion now as amended. Move to approve the American eel FMP review and state compliance reports for the 2021 fishing year and de minimis requests for New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, District of Columbia, Florida, Georgia, and the yellow eel fisheries. Please raise your hand in favor of the motion. Please raise your hand in opposition.
Any
abstentions? Any no votes? The motion passes 18-1. Okay, moving on to the next agenda item, I'll let the vice chair. Do we have any nominations? Shane.
From one Commonwealth to another, I would like to nominate Chris Kuhn as our American Eel Management Board Vice Chair.
So we have a second. Second, John Clark. Is there any discussion on this motion? Any opposition? Not seeing any opposition, I approve this motion. This motion is approved by the board by consent. On the last agenda item, is there any other business to come before this board? Not seeing any, can I have a motion to adjourn this meeting? Malcolm Rhodes, seconded by Doug Grout. Thank you, everyone.